There is something sinister about the coastline of the British Isles, which stretches for some 7,000 miles. It's home to grand hotels and picturesque promenades. On the surface, there are bright lights and funfairs, sandy beaches and beautiful sunsets. But dig a little deeper in the sand and you uncover an underworld of murder and mayhem. In Coastal Killers, we take a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea and life meets death. A shoreline that is awash with tales of death and depravity. These are the chilling true stories of Britain's worst coastal killers. There are many uncanny parallels between the world of the theatre, especially those on the end of a seaside pier, and a great murder trial. And in today's episode, that proves to be particularly true. The victim was a music hall star, and the accused a fine dancer who became the focus of one of the most dramatic trials in British criminal history. We travel to Brighton in the 1930s. The town then was a magnet for tourists eager to enjoy its golden sands, famous Palace Pier, and vibrant seaside shows. But the case in question today was to transform Brighton's reputation and create a national sensation. The characters at the centre of the drama, a man called Tony Mancini, who had murdered his girlfriend, Violet Kay, and bundled her body into a trunk.
We look at serial killers or killers, we sort of glamorise them in many ways, but Tony Mancini was a nobody. He was a common thief. He had many aliases. He'd been in trouble with the police before. He drifted through society on a wing and a prayer.
Tony Mancini was a vicious thug. He was an out-and-out liar. Almost every other word or line that I wrote about him concealed yet another lie.
One of the names he adopted was Hyman Gold, which is quite a stereotypically Jewish name. And that's interesting that Mancini being an Italian name, Hyman Gold being perceived to be a Jewish name, he's seeking to make himself part of a community that he doesn't actually belong in. And you wonder whether he was feeling a bit lost. He's not quite sure of where he belongs in British society. So he's trying to find an identity that's more obvious, that's easily understood, and that he can say he's a part of.
Tony Mancini was a petty criminal in London. At one point, he claimed to have been a ruthless thug on behalf of London's criminal underworld, capable of the most obscene violence, including cutting off the hands of people that the gang didn't approve of. I've always fundamentally doubted that claim. I think he was, in the end, a chancer, lived on the edge of the law, a little bit of this and that, but was actually rather vain. The claim to be a very good dancer, for example, was something that mattered a great deal to him. But he was, in the end, no more than an awful, rather second-rate, petty criminal.
We will find out more about what happened to Mancini when he arrived in Brighton. But to better understand this story, we first begin with a shocking event at Brighton Station on the 17th of June, 1934.
A man in the left luggage office of Brighton Railway Station, whose name was Vinicum, smelt an extraordinary smell from a plywood trunk that had been left there 11 days earlier. He called the police. I suspect he thought there was something awful inside this really quite large trunk. Chief Inspector Ronald Donaldson arrived to examine the trunk and decided to open it. He duly did so to discover the dismembered torso of a woman. No head, no arms, no legs.
It must be an awful shock finding this torso. It's unrecognisable almost because it's not part of a complete body. But also there's this element of voyeurism there, that you imagine this poor woman who's now dead with male strangers looking on at her, examining her. It's kind of so depersonalised and so upsetting, thinking, if that was my daughter, how would I feel about that, knowing that she's just there naked and these people looking at her.
In London, not long afterwards, there is another revolting discovery. The legs of a young woman in a suitcase in the left luggage office of King's Cross Railway Station. There is nothing to identify her. Indeed, there's been nothing to identify the torso in Brighton. No personal details, no clothes, no diary, no handbag, nothing. Just as horrific as the Brighton discovery is the discovery in King's Cross in London. Only this time, the legs are named after the woman's feet. She was to be called the girl with the pretty feet, or sometimes just pretty feet.
What became clear very quickly was that the legs of the girl with the pretty feet belonged to the torso found in Brighton Station. But who was she?
There were no real clues. I mean, Sir Bernard Spilsbury did a post-mortem examination on really the very next day. But what the torso did reveal was that she was 4 to 5 months pregnant.
Something like that, something as horrific and as dramatic as that discovery, sent a shudder through Brighton. Yes, it may have had a slightly louche reputation, but nevertheless, to discover a torso in a trunk at the railway station was quite remarkable. Suddenly, headlines began. The Brighton trunk murder. There was no description of who might have left the trunk. So you have this extraordinary, frightening discovery that proves that somewhere, someone is capable of the most depraved crime imaginable. Killing a woman who is 5 months pregnant, cutting off her head, her arms and her legs, and leaving them, the torso in Brighton and the legs in London. It was literally a mystery, but one which was so ghastly, so extraordinary, that it provoked literally an outcry. Perhaps nowadays, all these years later, we wouldn't take it so seriously. But in 1934, it became literally a cause célèbre. The Brighton trunk murder was headline news across the country.
A torso of a young woman was found in a trunk at Brighton Station and her legs discovered at King's Cross. Both discoveries would come to impact on the life of Tony Mancini in a way that no one would have expected, least of all him. While still living in London, he encountered a 42-year-old music hall performer and began a tempestuous and ultimately tragic affair.
1 year earlier, in London, a dancer called Violet Kay, who had had a considerable career in the music hall as a double act and part of a series of dancer girls. At one point, she had earned herself £1,000 a week, a fortune in the 1930s.
Violet's situation wasn't uncommon, particularly in this era. There was a lot of economic depression, and The entertainment industry was very, very hard, especially for women. You were on short-term contracts, you didn't have a lot of security. It was very easy to find yourself out of work for a short space of time and to struggle then to find some other way of making a living.
Sadly, her career had begun to disintegrate around her. She had descended into prostitution in an effort to keep her body and soul. She was 42 years old, and her beauty, to be fair, was waning.
Work became less, she couldn't earn money, and she started to drift, sadly like so many people, into a seedier type of lifestyle, ending up in London on the fringes of prostitution, possibly prostitution, with a drink problem. And this is not unusual with show business characters when their star starts to fade.
She met Tony Mancini in a London bar, and there was an instant attraction, despite the obvious age difference.
What was the attraction of Mancini to Violet Kay? That I think I can explain. She had been a star. She was well known. He was insignificant. For Kay, the attraction of Mancini was clear enough. He was young, he was attractive, he wasn't dazzling, but he was vibrant, and he was slightly flashy. So you can sort of see what might have brought these two very unlikely partners together. But actually, I think they were both supporting each other on the road to destruction. They could not have survived. It was not possible.
Violet was actually fully attracted, and she found his rough and ready character, his kind of psychopathic charm, very kind of appealing. However, from Mancini's point of view, he saw her really as some kind of earner, someone to produce a regular income and give him some kind of stability when he came home. Unfortunately, Violet needed a lot more interaction than that.
You can understand more why Violet would have been attracted to him. He was a younger man, he was quite dapper. He must have seemed a bit of a dangerous character as well, which can be quite exciting.
With almost 16 years difference between them, there was this problem that they saw different things in their relationship.
He's young, he's good looking, he gives her a bit of life, makes her feel that she's young too and that she's got something to look forward to. So you can't help feeling that her motives might have been a bit purer than his.
In September 1933, 9 months before the girl with the pretty feet was discovered, Violet and Mancini decided to leave London to set up home together in Brighton. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but life there was harder than they thought.
They arrived in Brighton and they started drifting from seedy flat to seedy flat, renting under different names, slum landlord tenants, on the fringes, on the outer fringes of the more genteel Brighton society. So we have to imagine that there they are, this couple drinking. She was the breadwinner, being a prostitute, and every day she would regularly go down to the seafront promenade, dressed in her finery, and pick up gentlemen.
You can imagine the scene. They're doing their best, but scraping a living is hard to do. Violet, I'm afraid, returns to prostitution. It isn't necessarily a happy relationship. Every time Violet takes a client back to the dingy rooms, Mancini has to make himself scarce. Go to the local pub, walk about. Because Violet is really the only person capable of earning sufficient money to sustain her appetite for alcohol.
Tony Mancini and Violet Kay were leading a very unsettled life. very much at the lower end of the spectrum. She had clients from London who actually came down to Brighton to continue visiting her. She wasn't unattractive, but she was prone to drunkenness. She also took morphine. She was pretty washed out, but still had some looks.
By the spring of 1934, Mancini had managed to secure a job at the Skylark Cafe, a popular destination on the seafront. There he earned himself the nickname the Dancing Waiter. But on the 10th of May, the tranquility of the cafe was rudely interrupted. Mancini was serving tea to an attractive teenager called Elizabeth Attrell, who occasionally worked there, when Violet suddenly stormed in.
Violet turns up at the Skylark Cafe, I'm afraid a little the worse for wear, and berates the man she's living with, Mancini, for his interest in Elizabeth Attrell. You can imagine the scene. Violet, older than Mancini, absolutely infuriated that the man who was sharing her bed should take an interest, and completely loses her temper. There is a dreadful, dreadful scene, witnessed by a number of the other clients of the Skylark Cafe.
She saw Tony serving Attrell, and he said to her, "There you are, mate, here's your tea." And Violet, at that point, became furious. She said to him, "Don't you dare call her mate." And he went over to calm her down.
The row between Mancini and Violet in the Skylark Cafe on the seafront at Brighton that morning in May was unbelievably ferocious. They literally screamed at one another. She accusing him of being too close to Elizabeth Attrell, he telling her, probably in no uncertain terms, that she was a faded old drunk.
According to some of their friends, although not all, because their views seem to be quite polarised, they had quite a tempestuous relationship. I think they both had short tempers. So their relationship would have been quite volatile anyway. I think there was probably quite a bit of insecurity on Violet's part. You know, she knew she was getting older. She knew he might be tempted by younger women nearer his own age. And so I think, you know, she heard rumours from friends, from acquaintances, that he was kind of flirting with other girls, one girl in particular. And I think that would have made her very insecure. You know, she doesn't want to lose this relationship. She doesn't want to have that insecurity. How is that going to threaten her? And so she raises it with him. She asks him if he's having an affair.
Clearly, the relationship with Violet and Tony Mancini was starting to fall apart. And there came this point where this argument was so foul, people said there was a tremendous argument, that she stormed out of the Skylark Cafe and went home. And Tony would have followed her. And when they got back to their seedy apartment, there the row really erupted.
And as the row between the couple escalated, it was to end in tragedy. Mancini was incensed that Violet had caused a scene in the Skylark Cafe, so he followed her back to her lodgings to confront her there.
There was the explosion of anger, and at no point after that explosion was Violet ever to be seen again.
I think they argued and he overreacted and went too far.
He lost his rag.
He was not going to take this anymore.
Had a burst of passion, of temper.
And he picked up the only thing that was at hand, as it happened to be, a hammer.
She said, "Give me that hammer." And he said, "I'll let you have the hammer, all right."
And he struck her with it. And he probably struck her with it with such force, in one rage of argument, that she fell to the floor dead. After he'd killed her and realised that she was dead, his mind would have literally imploded. He would have panicked the shock that he just killed this woman that he actually loved and who fed him and cared for him, and she would never bring him back. She's gone. His mind would have disintegrated. What does Tony Mancini do looking down at his girl dead? This is not an intelligent man. What do I do? Wait a minute. I've got an idea. I'll go and buy a trunk and put her in there. And that's precisely what he did.
Horrified by what he had done, Mancini decided he had to cover up Violet's death. He came up with an elaborate story to explain his sudden disappearance.
Tony Mancini told friends of both he and Violet that she'd gone to Paris. Unlikely, you might say, because she was certainly a little faded for the Folies Bergère, but nevertheless, that was his story. A day or two later, Violet's sister, Olive, received a telegram which said, and I quote, "Going abroad, good job, sail Sunday, will write," thereby confirming the story that Mancini had told their friends.
For all his rough and ready nature, Mancini had a very eloquent way with words and a manner that was kind of manipulative in almost every avenue of his life. He extended this quite usefully in terms of covering up Violet's disappearance, in concocting letters and concocting notes and putting out rumours, etc. Basically, he did quite a good job of covering up the fact that Violet had just suddenly disappeared.
Mancini even went so far as to give Elizabeth Atchell clothes belonging to Violet, saying she didn't need them anymore.
It's kind of completely replacing the old girlfriend with the new, turning one into the other by saying, here, have my old girlfriend's clothes, and that makes you my new girlfriend. It's all very peculiar, and it's not the actions of somebody who's concerned about his girlfriend disappearing. So he knows what's happened to her, and he almost closes off and says, right, she's dead, let's get on with my life.
I think Mancini here was completely out of his depth. He'd been involved in all sorts of pranks in his life. However, I don't think it included murder, and not murder committed by himself. And I don't think he would have panicked. I think he would have just been a bit confused and thrown out and wrong-footed in terms of what do I do with this. He did not have a clear plan.
What Tony does with her body afterwards is one of the reasons I don't think the murder was premeditated, because it's the actions of somebody who doesn't know what he's doing, really, hasn't thought things out enough. So he puts her body in a box, then he moves house to lodgings near Brighton Station, but takes the box with him.
Mancini couldn't think through any of this. So he thought, right, I will get this trunk and I will use my intelligence and I will put her in it and I will have her moved and we'll move her to another flat. Because what can he do? He can't carry this big heavy trunk around Brighton. He's got no means of taking it into a desolate area and burying her. So he thinks, well, I'll just keep her in the trunk. And he didn't dismember her because he actually loved her. He couldn't bring himself to chop her up and parcel bits of her up and then take the legs somewhere and the head somewhere else, like a lot of them did, and the feet somewhere else. He just kept her all together.
Just a few days after Violet's murder, Mancini moved to 52 Kemp Street. It is here that the story of what he does with her body becomes even more bizarre. He covers the trunk with a cloth and uses it as a bedside table.
What an extraordinary thing to do. There can be no logical explanation. He could perfectly well have left her, but no, he didn't.
He's boxed that bit of his brain away that says what he did with her, and he can close it off and forget what's in there. But whichever way you look at it, it's a really peculiar thing to do, that he's living with her body. And yes, you could say, well, he's scared, he doesn't know what to do with it, he panics. But he's got that reminder as time goes on and you can smell the body decomposing and you can see it happening. You can't ignore it. You know, you're reminded of it every time you go into that room.
And it's starting to smell. And it's ooze coming out onto the floor. And people in the premises are thinking, there's a funny smell here. And when they ask him, he says, well, I keep rabbits.
The idea of Mancini just sitting there, you know, with the smell of violet all around the room, would kind of, you'd think he'd be revolted, you'd think he'd panic, but he wasn't. He was fairly calm. It was probably something of an annoyance. However, he wasn't that troubled, and this is where the lack of empathy and the lack of conscience kicks in. And this dictates that he could put up with this probably for as long as that body was going to decay.
Picture, if you will, how Mancini must have felt in his bed in the new lodgings in Kemp Street, with Violet decomposing almost beneath his feet. The smell must have been outrageous. Neighbours were beginning to complain. There were fluids leaking from the trunk. And yet, Mancini continues to live with Violet's body. Why? Was it that he wanted to keep Violet close? Was it that he thought of her as a trophy, evidence of just what he was capable of? What led him to do that? Was it an act of love? I may have killed her, but I still love her. We'll never know.
Mancini lived in the flat with Violet's body for 2 months, not sure what to do with it next. It was at this point, in July 1934, that the most amazing of coincidences occurred, and Mancini's deception began to unravel.
And now you have this extraordinary collision of 2 cases. Just a matter of weeks after Violet's disappearance, the trunk with the torso is discovered at Brighton Railway Station. And an explosion of interest takes place.
When Tony was in the flat in 52 Kemp Street, obviously the word was out about the first trunk that had been found at Brighton Station in mid-June. We are now talking about a month later, when the police had got their inquiries well underway. They were trying to trace missing women. Violet Kay was regarded as missing by some of her friends who didn't clearly totally believe Tony. And he felt then that the net was closing in. It was just going to be a matter of time. Tony Mancini was very aware. He felt his collar was going to be felt before long. He was even telling people, he told a dance teacher called Miss Tin, whom he danced with at the ballroom, he said, do you know, he said, I think I've only got 4 days of happiness left. And he said, and Kemp Street is going to be all over the news. I mean, it's ridiculous how he's telling, almost preempting his own guilt.
Mancini discovered that the police were now doing house-to-house searches near Brighton Station, looking for clues relating to the torso of the girl found in the trunk. He had to get out of the flat and went on the run. And it's at this point that the police finally arrived at 52 Kemp Street, totally unaware of what they were about to uncover.
They open the trunk and there's Violet Kay, rotting away. Police are now looking all over the country for him, and he's arrested walking down the middle of the road by a traffic cop. And he gives a false name, but then he's brought for trial. So there was nothing in his head at all, nothing at all. He was a confused man, and he was probably broken-hearted.
Mancini was never linked by the police to the killing of the girl with the pretty feet, but he was charged with Violet's murder. The discovery of a second woman in a trunk just months apart caused a sensation.
These two extraordinary stories coalesce. And so instead of it being the Brighton trunk murder, it was eventually to become the Brighton trunk murders.
Not one, but two within a very short period. I mean, it's incredible. There had been a trunk murder in Brighton 100 years earlier, but I mean, for two in this very short space of time is extraordinary.
Brighton has a long history of trunk murders. It's quite odd in a way, but it also shows kind of how common this method of disposing women's bodies has been over time.
The trunk murders of Brighton suddenly were big national news, and Mancini had become, if you like, feeding his narcissistic tendencies, quite a celebrity.
In December 1934, Tony Mancini stood trial at Lewes Court. Thousands of people surrounded the court, desperate to hear every tiny detail of the case. But it wasn't just Mancini who was on trial. So too was the character of Violet Kay.
When the prosecution closed against Tony Mancini, it must have been abundantly clear to almost every person in the courtroom that Mancini was guilty. It wasn't until Mancini's defence lawyer, Norman Burkitt, got to his feet, adjusted his gown, settled his wig upon his head, and began his defence of his client, that everything began to change. Burkitt questioned every piece of prosecution evidence with the most meticulous care. In particular, he pointed out that Violet was a prostitute with a known temper and an alcoholic. He pointed out that she had a great deal of morphine in her system when she was found. He pointed out that it was entirely possible that one of her clients as a prostitute might have killed her. It was equally possible, was it not, that she might have fallen down under the influence of the drugs and the alcohol, hit her head and died. What was, without question, is he placed in the jury's mind the single thought that there was a reasonable doubt that Tony Mancini killed Violet Kay.
Mancini's court case was groundbreaking. It was a classic case of the defence actually really overcoming any element of the prosecution by suddenly coming out with plausible reasons for the death of Violet, who they portrayed as being a lowlife. Not that Mancini wasn't, but the idea of a fallen lady who came across these times and fell foul of her clients, or perhaps tottered down the steps to the flat and hurt herself that way.
That was the seed of doubt that went into the jury's mind. Tony is saying he came back and found her dead, panicked, didn't know what to do, and therefore he put her in the trunk.
Well, there's various elements of the trial that concern me, particularly involving the reputation of the victim. It's very common to see a female victim have her reputation tarnished in court as a means of making her seem guilty for her own murder, in a way. And I think that's what happened in this trial. There's also conflict between different people's views of the relationship, that you had some people saying, yes, they had this tempestuous relationship. You had other people saying, no, they were very contented, there were no problems at all. And when you look at Tony's defence, where he's saying, oh, you know, I found her dead and I knew the police would suspect me because I'm a bit of a criminal, that's why I didn't say anything. It seems so absurd to us.
After a 5-day trial, the jury deliberated for 2¼ hours and delivered their verdict: not guilty. Tony Mancini walked out of court a free man, with no one more surprised than him. But what happened next was even more extraordinary. In December 1934, in a dramatic turn of events, Tony Mancini was cleared of the murder of Violet Kay. But more than 40 years later, his story took on an even more surprising and bizarre turn.
42 years pass. Mancini is now in his 70s. And in 1976, Tony Mancini gives an interview to a journalist from the News of the World called Alan Hart, in which he confesses to the murder of Violet Kay.
Tony Mancini agreed to meet Alan Hart at a secret location in the north of England to give his true account of what happened.
Back in November 1976, I was working as a staff reporter in the News of the World office in Manchester when I received a telephone call, and it was from a man who turned out to be Tony Mancini. He told me that he had an interesting story to tell. I asked him what the story was about, and he told me that back in the 1930s, he'd been involved in a famous murder trial. It was called the Brighton trunk murder. I'd read the cuttings before I went to meet him. We went then out to a pub of his choice so that he could discuss the case. When we got to Mancini's local pub, he then told me the story of how he had murdered Violet Kay. In point of fact, he said it might have been manslaughter because he didn't mean to kill her. But he told me how he had in fact killed her, even though years before he had insisted to a jury that he had found her dead body. So Mancini had taken her home, and there she had collapsed on the bed while he put some coal on the fire. He'd picked up a hammer to break the coal into small pieces and was in the process, so he said, of putting the coal on the fire when all of a sudden he felt a blow from behind, and he discovered that Violet had picked up the hammer and hit him on the back of the head with it. He wrestled the hammer from Violet. In the struggle that ensued, he pushed her away and she went to the back of the room. But he said that she said to him, "Give me that hammer," and he threw the hammer at her. According to Mancini, the hammer hit her on the left temple, causing her to spin round, and as he put it, she fell like a rag doll to the floor of the room where they were lodging. When I asked him how he felt after he realised that Violet was dead, he was more concerned with how it would affect him than the fact that he'd just taken a life, because he thought that this would mean he would be hanged for murder. Mancini went on to say that what happened next was pretty much exactly as he'd told the jury in the 1930s in court. He put her body in a trunk that he'd bought. While Mancini was telling me about what he'd done, I took a contemporaneous note of his story. I was very aware that this was a sensational story, and I was trying to just pretend that people confessing to murders was something that happened almost every day in my life, which, of course, nothing could be further from the truth.
To suddenly declare to a Sunday paper that I did it, yes, and this is how I did it, you know, and show no remorse, quite callous. Again, he was in the limelight.
If you look at the details of what he says, he is still trying to blame Violet for her own murder. He's saying that it was her jealousy, that she tried to attack him first, kind of implying that he only murdered her out of self-defence. There's no evidence for this at all. It's just his story. And 40 years later, can we believe those details?
I suspect he sanitises the truth, because he said, "Oh, she approached me with a hammer and I took it off her and I threw it at her in anger and I hit her on the left temple, killing her, and I panicked." I suspect it was much, much darker than that. and that Mancini actually set out to kill her.
As always with Mancini, there was that subtext of money. The idea that you could make money out of this kind of situation, and he was hoping probably that this story would suddenly spiral out as it had done in the past, and he would be somebody again, and he would be making money again out of a crime.
The article made the front page of the News of the World, but Mancini didn't receive a fee for his story, and it failed to bring him the fame or money that he'd hoped for.
After the story had been published in that weekend's News of the World, I believe Mancini left the area, and I don't know where he went after that.
Mancini may have sought notoriety for his crime, but what of his victim? In the summer of 1934 in Brighton, 2 women had lost their lives. The head and arms of the girl with the pretty feet were never found. She wasn't ever identified, and her killer never caught. Violet Kay most definitely died at the hands of Tony Mancini, but he literally got away with murder, despite his confession.
I feel very sorry for Violet Kay, actually, because she's remembered by what she was when she died, which was a middle-aged woman who'd obviously had a bit of a hard time. She was working as a prostitute, and that's how she becomes known. And it fits our standard narrative about murder, that we want to believe that women who are murdered because they're from the wrong side of the tracks. They might be sex workers. There's all these negative connotations that we still have today, and that she's been lumbered with as well. And actually, people forget that, you know, she was an engaging character. She clearly had a lovely personality. She attracted people. She attracted friends. She'd attracted this man who's a lot younger than her, young enough to be her son. And if you look at a surviving photo of her as a middle-aged woman, you can still see that she's got this absolutely amazing smile. She's clearly had a lot going on in her life. She's been a dancer. She's had a career. She's earned a good amount of money in the past. For me, the saddest part of the trunk murders in Brighton was the fact that the first woman was never identified. Her torso had been found in Brighton, her legs had been found in London, her arms and her head were never found. She could never be identified.
All of you watching this programme now will probably say, well, what was so remarkable about this case? What is remarkable is how unremarkable it is. We know who done it, we know what done it, we know where done it, but we don't know why done it, which is fascinating. But what is gruesome is the fact that the body was put in a trunk.
I believe Mancini did kill Violet, and it was in the violence of that interaction that they always seem to have in their relationship. I don't think Mancini was, if you like, a killer per se. He wasn't someone who would go on to be a serial killer. He was not someone who enjoyed killing, and he did not enjoy the process at all. So I think he was someone who just cleverly covered up, someone who didn't just con a jury, he conned a nation.
There was a suggestion that Mancini might be charged with perverting the course of justice, but in the end, that was never pursued, and Mancini went to his grave having escaped the gallows.